Good morning. I was expecting to say, I apologize for being late. But as it turns out, it's 10 after 10, and I had thought I would give this talk at 10. So I'm not really late. Coming in, making bows, offering incense, and setting up the voice recorder. Yeah, that all takes about 10 minutes or so. I would like to thank you all for this opportunity to practice. It's unlikely that I would be giving this talk if I thought that nobody was going to listen. However unlikely it is, there's always a possibility that I would. Shortly after I started teaching at San Francisco Zen Center, we would go into the Buddha Hall for a lecture on Wednesday evening. And often enough, I would get there early when the room was still being set up, or just after it was set up. And I'd walk into the room and it would be empty. Just zafus arranged for people to sit on. And I thought, what would I do if I came to give the talk sometime and nobody showed up? If I was presented with this empty room of zafus and candles and statues and chairs. And I thought, maybe I would still go ahead and give the talk. Give the talk to an empty room, to zafus and chairs and candles and walls. Preach the Dharma to inanimate objects. So this is a slight variation, because I actually believe that somebody will listen to it. So good morning. Thank you for your practice. And thank you for this opportunity to practice. So we're in the midst of a pandemic. And last night, I looked at some statistics. We had gone over the 1,100,000 mark. I think we were approaching the 1,200,000 mark. That's the number of cases known. And we were approaching 65,000 deaths. These figures are, of course, huge, colossal. And by the end of the week ahead, we'll probably be at 1.5 million cases and over or more than 100,000 deaths. That's a lot to take in. thoughts are with those who have been and will be bereaved, and those who are dying and who have died. And to all of us participating in this talk, before this is through, some of us may have died. And if not, in all likelihood, we will know somebody who has died. So this cloud of COVID is enveloping the human world. And although every cloud has a silvery lining, that silvery lining will be of little or no comfort to the bereaved and the dying. So far, in my life, I'm experiencing this COVID cloud kind of remotely. My life hasn't been that much affected by it, except that the context of my life has changed a lot. But my day-to-day life hasn't changed that much. I notice it when I go out shopping. The different protocols for going into supermarkets and post office. The closure of cafes, restaurants, hardware stores. The lack of people on the streets. I notice it when I go outside. But for the most part, it's a little bit remote. Just the daily news brings it home. And what would the silvery lining be of this dark cloud? My thoughts keep going to love in the time of COVID, or Zen in the time of COVID. Maybe this pandemic will give rise to wonderful and profound literature. Maybe this lockdown, this global lockdown, will reduce our carbon footprint significantly enough so that for this year alone, or for this year at least, we'll meet our CO2 emissions targets. And maybe it will change how we actually go about living our lives, change it perhaps for the better. Maybe it will, and maybe it won't. Literature, says Simone de Beauvoir, in her wonderful excellent tour de force of existentialist thinking, The Second Sex. Literature, she says, acquires sense and dignity when it makes its appeal to people engaged in projects that enable them or empower them to transcend the limitations of their birth. I was turned on to The Second Sex by my late brother-in-law. In my early 20s. He died much too young, 12 or 13 years ago. He died from the other big C. He was a great brother-in-law, and I like to think of him as a great friend. I remember him as a great friend. So he turned me on to The Second Sex, a formidable volume which lay on my shelf for a long time before I got around to reading it. And a few years before that, he turned me on to Colin Wilson's The Outsider. I don't remember much of what Wilson said, but that book was a great reference book, a great pointer towards other books. It's because of Wilson's The Outsider that I was introduced to Dostoevsky, Hesse, Nietzsche, the existentialist thinkers and existentialist writers. It set me on a course of reading existentialist material. And after a few years of reading these books, after a few years of being on the quest, on the adventure of finding some kind of truth, I'd kind of given up. The well had run dry, and I began to feel something was missing. So I thought, maybe meditation is the answer. As a teenager, I had been introduced to two forms of meditation. I think it was my brother, but it may have been one of my sisters, who brought a book home. And that book was called Yoga for Health by Richard Hiltelman and Linda, can't remember her last name. So I did some of the yoga postures as best I could. I was able to do a wonderful, excellent, superb headstand. And in the back of that book, there was a short section on meditation. And the meditation was fairly simple. count the breaths at the exhale, 1 to 10, and start again. The other form of meditation that I'd been introduced to was TM as a teenager, transcendental meditation. So in my 20s, when I began to feel, after this wonderful burst of enthusiastic reading and searching for the ultimate truth, when I began to feel that something was missing, I thought, maybe it's meditation. And I did not want to take up transcendental meditation again because I dropped it when I learned that it was really another religion in disguise. So I started to do this very simple meditation practice. And perhaps that is what opened the doors of perception. Shortly after starting this, I was in Eason's, O'Connell Street, Dublin. Yes, bookstore. And I came across or caught sight of this book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. First of all, beginners. That sounded good. I was looking for a new adventure, a new exploration, and a new exploration of the mind. So Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. That was really good. The book itself, well, before that, another part of the title was Zen. My brother-in-law had taught me to ride a motorcycle. And in my late teens, I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And so Zen was ineffably connected with motorcycles, and therefore good. I did not know what Zen was. I had no experience of Zen. But because of Pirsik's connecting it with motorcycles, I had a favorable disposition towards it. So Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, was a great title for me. The book itself was fairly slim, so it should be a quick read. And the chapters were very short. So with a new sense of enthusiasm and starting the journey again, I bought this book and brought it home. What was really wonderful about reading Suzuki Roshi's book, and when I was in the store, you turn over the back and you see this wonderful picture of Suzuki Roshi. I remember seeing something, I think it was in the epilogue or the prologue. Maybe it was an introduction by Richard Baker. And it said San Francisco Zen Center, 1971. And I remember thinking, I bet they're all gone by now. This was in the 90s. So reading this book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, was another opening. Because Suzuki Roshi was not trying to teach me to meditate. He was not laying out some kind of program. Instead, what was happening in reading this book was that I was presented with a new way of life. Not just a new way of grasping life, but there was an actual different handle on life that maybe I could grasp. And then, shortly after reading this book a few times, I saw an advertisement in a Dublin magazine, and it said, "Free public talk by an ordained Buddhist teacher in the Well-Fed Cafe." I'd been to the Well-Fed Cafe frequently, where I was well fed, and it was a cooperative. So a place that I was familiar with and favorably disposed towards. I decided to go. The talk, was okay. But at the end, Sangha said he would be giving a meditation course 1 evening a week for 6 weeks. And if you think you'd be interested, leave your name and address on this piece of paper. So I did the meditation course. And after a few years, I decided to go to Vajrakuta in order to live in a community. It's while I was living at Vajrakuta that my interest in Zen was rekindled, and I read some books on Zen. And it got to the point where I felt I really had to do something about my desire or thirst for Zen practice. I had read D.T. Suzuki's, different Suzuki that is, D.T. Suzuki's Essays on Zen Buddhism and the Manual of Zen Buddhism, Philip Kaplow's 3 Pillars of Zen. Some of Robert Aitken's newsletters. And I'd read John Cleary's brother to Thomas, the well-known, famous translator Thomas Cleary. This was his brother, lesser known, but still good translator. Maybe it runs in the family, translating. John Cleary's Zen Dawn in the West. And when I was leaving Vajrakuta, the community gave me a present, a translation by Thomas Cleary called Rational Zen, a compilation of works. And all this material was inspiring. And eventually I made my way to Green Gulch. Last week I talked about the first practice period there, and how every day was very similar to the previous day, almost identical, and very similar to what would be the next day. almost identical. Little variations and little things to look forward to. There was dessert on Friday night, and Friday was our day off. There was a half-day sit on Thursday. And on Sunday was public day, and Sunday breakfasts were as good as any dessert. So there are little things to look forward to. And there was this great container for practice. The regularity, the rhythm, the deepening. It was an 8-week practice period, but I had also, in the middle of it, signed up for the following practice period. And I could see this trajectory going on, this 16 weeks. There was an interval of about 6 weeks. So now we're talking about 24 weeks or 22 weeks. And I could see that this would just go on and on and on. This continuous effort to be present and creating this environment which made it easier to make that effort. I could see that the interval between the two practice periods is actually when practice would be difficult. I knew that I would continue to practice during that interval, but that it wouldn't be as easy as during the practice period. During the practice period, there's a lot of silence. And so there's also a lot of meditation, and there's some work. And in all these things, the effort is very similar. The effort to be present and to observe the inner life, the inner processes. One of the things that really inspired me to take up Zen was when I was at Vajrakuta reading John Cleary's Zen Dawn in the West. There was this line in it, very, very powerful line. It said, "The true practitioners of old," I hope you're ready for this, when he talks about the true practitioners of old, I think this was written around about the 8th century of the Common Era. So the two true practitioners of old could be referring to 700 or 800 years before that, or 1,000+ years before that. The true practitioners of old had nothing to look forward to. How come they had nothing to look forward to? Is it because their life was so miserable? that they were in a perpetual, never-ending doldrums? I doubted. They had nothing to look forward to. Was it because they were so present that they derived complete satisfaction from being present? So this phrase would permeate my consciousness at Green Gulch. And there was so much space and silence and solitude, although we're in a community. That I could see when I was looking forward to something and sense the distraction of that process, of putting a distance between myself and where I am right here, distracting myself. But the sense of traction, movement, motion, and distance. So moving away from where I am, could sense that. The distraction of looking forward to something. Could also see that you can be setting yourself up for disappointment. So the true practitioners of old had nothing to look forward to. We should envy them that, not pity them that. So to be able to observe this process and its consequences, to be able to fine-tune your attention to the inner process so that you can see where that looking forward to is leading and where that is coming from. Is it coming from a dissatisfaction with what is in front of you right now? The true practitioners of old had nothing to look forward to. Studying the self is not to criticize the self or reprimand the self, but to observe. And that needs a certain amount of silence and stillness. And that is in part at temples created by the repetition, by the routine, by the way in which we go about our respective tasks. Another phrase that I took with me from Vajrakutta, well, I think this came a little bit after. I was reading Rational Zen, and it wasn't that easy or interesting a read. But when you're looking for a needle in a haystack. You don't want to let things go by in case you miss a vital clue. So I read something and it pointed me to a footnote. I can't remember what I read, but the footnote leaped out at me. Here was a vital clue for my journey. The footnote said, and this is the one thing that I remember from that very erudite book, the one thing that I remember, and which put wind in my sail. The footnote said, your lucky day is when you realize it's all the same day. We can kind of grasp this intellectually, not so much by taking a bird's eye view. It might be better to take a God's eye view or a galaxy's view. The galaxy doesn't have days. From the galaxy's point of view, it's all the same day. Doing a practice period, this constant redoing of the same tasks, all of them vital. It's amazing. When we eat 3 meals today, we still need to eat 3 meals tomorrow. In this repetition of tasks and bringing our attention to the task and to the mental processes that accompany it, in the repetition of that, every day begins to feel the same. And we may begin to intuit what is meant by it's all the same day. But this footnote says, your lucky day is when you realize it's all the same day. So this structure of a practice period may help you to get a feel for it, but it doesn't automatically bring about the realization or the subjective experience of it's all the same day. So I should say on that footnote, clearly says, an ancient Zen master said, your lucky day is when you realize it's all the same day. He doesn't say who the ancient Zen master was. So this is perhaps another silvery lining to this cloud of COVID. In lockdown, we are taken away from the busyness of our regular life. Well, some of us are. I know some people are working from home and they're as busy as when they were working from work. But they don't have the commute. And their life is a little bit more centered, perhaps. They don't have the same interruptions, so they're actually getting more done. If we are in lockdown and at home, we can approach this as a practice period. Try to do the same things at the same time. Try to meditate at the same time every day. Try to have your meals at the same time every day. Get into a rhythm which repeats itself. And bring your attention to the tasks and to the mental processes accompanying those tasks. And have the intention to be present. Have the intention to observe. Have the intention to practice. When you are practicing, when you are on the path, everything becomes an opportunity to practice. If you have to travel because of work, traveling becomes an opportunity to practice. If you have to travel for family reasons or for vacation reasons, that is an opportunity to practice. If you're told by your government to stay at home, that we're in lockdown, that is your opportunity to practice. But what I feel is the lockdown can be very similar to a practice period. So I'm tending to think of this as the COVID practice period. And in all our practice, we're constantly coming to terms with impermanence. Sooner or later, this heart will stop beating. And that is true of everyone listening and of everyone who isn't listening. It's true from tadpole to human and from frog to God. Anyone, anything that has a heart, that heart will one day stop. And we will be left in silence. Thank you all very much.